Hello, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ron from International Trade Council. So before we start, I would like to thank you guys for attending today's event. I just want to make a quick audio check. If you guys can hear me, can you please type in yes on the comment section before we start, just to make sure that the audio is clear? All right, perfect. Thank you so much for that response. So before we start the presentation, I'll just going to make some instruction here. So basically, we're going to have the presentation first, and then after the presentation is finished, we will be able to answer the questions. You can type in your questions on the comment section on the screen, and then the speaker will going to answer your question. So, all right, thank you so much for those response. Our webinar for today is the legal do's and don'ts of doing business internationally. Our speaker is Andrea Ewart, founder, CEO of Develop Trade Law LLC. The objective of this event is to sensitize to the major red flags to avoid when doing business internationally. Focus on U.S. law. Learn require due diligence steps in international transaction to minimize risk of violating the rules, and receive practical tips to maximize legal compliance and minimize liability, and learn key contractual provision to minimize the risk of not getting paid. So without any further ado, I'm going to give the stage to the speaker. Go ahead, Andrea.
Thank you very much, Ron. I am a new member of the council, and this is my very first presentation. I look forward to being an active member. For purposes of this webinar, I was having some internet connectivity issues, so I'm going to take myself off camera during the presentation and then come back on once the presentation is through. So knowing your customer and doing due diligence is particularly essential when doing business internationally, when doing business with a client or customer across borders in a country where if a problem develops, getting legal redress or getting a remedy will force you to be dealing with could involve you dealing with an unfamiliar and perhaps even unfriendly legal system. Of course, one of the outcomes that we all hope for from a successful business relationship is getting paid. And so it is important to take the steps to secure your transactions to increase the chances that you consistently get from the relationship what you expected when you entered into it. And that requires a well-written contract. And finally, it is also important to know the specific rules that your country applies to companies doing business outside of its borders. My focus is going to be on US rules because that's my area of expertise. And also because of the extraterritorial nature of many US rules that affect companies doing business. So just briefly, what do I mean by the extraterritorial nature of US export control laws? The US extends jurisdiction to US persons, which means the obvious things you would expect, including a company that's located within its borders and organized under its laws. But it also extends jurisdiction in some cases to companies that are not necessarily US organized companies, but may have a US presence, and then any operations of that company in some circumstances can be impacted by enforcement of certain US laws. And as I go through the presentation, I'll try to highlight some instances of the U.S. Takes this approach to enforcement of its export laws. All countries have penalties for non-compliance with their laws, and this is a snapshot of the huge penalties that a company can incur for non-compliance with U.S. trade laws. The Bureau of Industry and Security enforces export controls on dual-use items, and I'll talk about what those are. The Office of Foreign Assets and Control enforces U.S. laws on U.S. sanctions law. And then there's the anti-bribery laws enforced primarily by the Department of Justice, but also by the security, by the SEC. Those penalties can include fines, but you can also be denied the opportunity to continue to do business, to export your product or services. Any of the benefits that you may have acquired from the conduct or activity that has been determined to be a violation could be forfeited. And in cases where the conduct is considered or activity is considered to have been done willfully, you knew what the law was, you decided to go ahead and violate the law in any event, then you can be subject to criminal prosecution and imprisonment. So non-compliance in any of these scenarios can mean the end of your export business. So with that out of the way, just basically sharing what are the stakes, which are pretty high, let's go on to the legal do's and don'ts. We will talk about what is a wrong country, who are wrong persons, and how can you figure out what to do about any of those scenarios. What kinds of products or services would be considered wrong for export or could violate US export laws under certain conditions? What is a bribe? And what kinds of payments or transfers of items of value would be considered a violation of anti-bribery laws? And then some important do's: protecting your intellectual property, using a written contract, as I've already alluded to. And then some tools to be proactive so that your don'ts don't become, that you don't end up violating any of these rules. The US maintains a comprehensive economic embargo against these 5 countries. And it means that US persons or companies that the US has determined to fall within its jurisdiction when it applies these laws are prohibited from doing business with these countries, in these countries, without a license. Cuba is one country in particular where the US has strongly enforces its laws, and some of the provisions of the laws and enforcing the embargo against Cuba specifically point to the extraterritorial nature of these sanctions. So as a result, a number of the EU, Canada, to name, and there are probably others, have actually enacted anti-blocking laws to protect their citizens from the enforcement of, by the US, of its sanctions against Cuba. it's also important to point out that this obviously happens because the U.S. This is the U.S. embargo against Cuba is being done on a unilateral basis. This is not a multilateral sanction that is being enforced by other countries as well, as is the case with North Korea and Syria. And so what do you do? What do you pay attention to? It is, should you receive any kind of indication that you could possibly, as a US company or a company that wants to do business or periodically does business with the US, one could possibly be doing business with any of these countries, you want to stop. You want to pay attention and you want to get more information. This is not a situation where you want to try to save money by, for instance, not discussing the situation with your attorney or with an advisor. Many countries have offices or agencies that support or are willing to give free support on these issues. And it is also important to pay attention to, or to realize that the red flag may not necessarily point back directly to the country that is the target of the US sanction. Notably, in the case of the US sanctions against Iran, the United Arab Emirates and a few other countries are very often act as intermediaries, or companies, I should say, in those countries act as intermediaries for a company in Iran or an entity in Iran that is seeking to do business with the United States or with a company in the United States. So these are strong, any indicator, these are strong red flags, and the best advice I can give you in those situations is to stop and get strong support and advice before proceeding with any of these transactions. The US and other countries also maintain targeted sanctions. So in the case of these countries, there is not an economic embargo, as in the case with the 5 countries mentioned earlier, but there are sanctions that are targeted, directed towards specific sectors, specific activities or companies or individuals. And so if you do find yourself doing business with a company or entity that is in any of these countries, you want to proceed with caution. And you also want to pay attention to a country that's in the news, right? Particularly in the circumstances of some kind of conflict. And in the case of Russia and its military aggression against Ukraine, we are actually watching this scenario play out in very real time, because since the military or the beginning of military incursions and activities against Ukraine by Russia, sanctions have been imposed. They do not reach the level of an economic embargo, but activities, individuals, companies have been added to the as targeted sanctions entities by the US, not just by the US, but also Canada, European Union. Anybody following the news is familiar with this. For instance, Vladimir Putin and his entire circle, his inner circle, have now been added to the to as sanctions under these targeted sanctions against Russia. I also want to highlight here China and the relatively new focus on activities conducted by the military-industrial complex, as it's identified by the U.S. Cyber activities, certain companies that are using 5G technology, etc. And then most recently, a law that was enacted at the end of 2021, and that will take effect in June of this year, which is aimed at addressing the use of forced labor, specifically in the Xinjiang region. My apologies if I'm mispronouncing that, of China. Now, the law was passed, as I said, at the end of last year. It takes effect on June 1, 2022 of this year, giving companies that have operations in that particular part of China, or with specific companies that have been identified under this legislation or under the rules enforcing the legislation, time to redirect, take a look at their supply chain, and to take preventive or corrective action in anticipation of these new sanctions taking effect. So how do you know which entities or companies, etc., are being targeted under these sanctions? They're all included on this consolidated screening list. And I forgot to check whether folks are going to get a copy of this PowerPoint. I'm certainly happy to share it. But it takes you to this is a live link, which takes you to a screening list. See, I have list twice there, which consolidates what have been people or companies that have been identified as bad actors by any number of US or even US agencies or by other countries. Who are bad actors? They are the people, the companies that have been, that are the target of these sanctions that I just described earlier. There are also people, companies that have been identified as being involved in terrorist activities, narco trafficking, in nuclear proliferation, biological or chemical warfare proliferation, financing or funding terrorism, involved in money laundering. And so there is one of the US agencies, the Office of Foreign Assets Control in the US Department of Treasury, maintains a specially designated nationals list, which lists these terrorists, narcotic traffickers, etc. Other agencies also have their own lists. For instance, if a company violated US export control laws by shipping a wrong product or service without a license, then they would end up, for instance, on the list of that agency. And so this list consolidates the names of all of these entities and companies. When you're getting involved in an overseas a transaction with actually it doesn't even have to be overseas, I'd do it with a domestic person as well, it is an absolute must to check this consolidated screening list. it's not a bad idea to check the specially designated national list as well to see if your name or a name like yours appears on it. I mean, imagine, okay, before 9/11, I remember after 9/11, one of the first kind of instances that I was dealing with around this issue was someone, I can't remember where, from what country, but his name was Osama bin Laden. And I'm not lying, I'm not exaggerating. You know, before 9/11, perfectly decent name, right? And this particular person ended up in the crosshairs of US agencies because they happened to have what had been before 9/11 a perfectly, legitimate, non-threatening name. So checking this consolidated screening list for checking the names of your potential partners, companies, clients on this against this consolidated screening list is an absolute must. Now, what if you don't find them on that? So if you don't find their names on that list, then that is certainly an important starting point. But it is also important to be able to verify that you're dealing with a legitimate person, both to ensure that you're not violating US laws or the laws of your countries that maintain a similar list, as well as to ensure that you're not dealing with a scammer or an illegitimate company. And so, at a minimum, again, you're approached by or you are planning to reach out to a new potential client, a new potential customer, a new potential partner. You need to do your due diligence and request the following information: their full name. You want to get their name in the local language, and you want to be able, so even if it's not in a character that you can read, Google Translate, wonderful tool, right? Put it in and see what comes up, and use Google Translate to be able to look at what it says. Their actual business registration number, address, contact numbers. Searching on the internet, I've heard that the who is search can be circumvented, but there's also this Ripoff Report. Some people may already be familiar with it, where companies are encouraged to report issues or problems that they have had where they have been ripped off by a particular individual or company. And so this is another live link that when you get the PowerPoint, you can get access to, or you can just, check it out yourself, and it will contain the list of, you screen any of your potential customers, clients, etc., against the results on that list. You can also just, enter these names into your search engine, followed by the words fraud or scam or cheat or anything else that you want, because, one of the beautiful things in this age in which we live is that information can get shared very, very quickly. And you need to use it to ensure that you do not do business with the wrong persons. There are also certain industries that tend to, based on people with whom I've spoken who follow this issue, they say there's a stronger likelihood that they could be associated with scamming activities or fraudulent activities, particularly when associated with a particular country. So the use of the word import-export or international trade in the name of a Chinese company, a company that's in China that purports to be involved in chemicals, in any number of African countries purported to be involved in oil or gas or mining. And then in Asia, a company that says, they're an investment company. Now, hear me very carefully. I'm not in any way suggesting that all companies or entities in these regions that use these words in their name or whatever are illegitimate or potentials planning to scam you. What I am reiterating is the need to do the due diligence where you are encountering a new client, a new company, a new that you wish to that you choose to want to do you may want to do business with. And it's important to realize that a legitimate company is not going to or is not very likely to resist requesting your request for that information, because they are likely doing the same thing with regard to you before, after you've reached out or before they reached out to you, and will be perfectly, okay with you requesting the information that you need to do to conduct your due diligence to ensure that you don't end up doing business with wrong persons. So the export of some U.S. technology, again, this is not just in the case of the U.S., but is controlled, and you either require, and to export it either requires a license that has to be applied for, or could require that you provide notification of your plans to export this technology, this product to, or this service, this technical data to a given country. Particularly important here are what I refer to as dual use items, and I referred to that before, which are controlled by the U.S. Bureau of Industry and Security. So what are dual use items? Dual use items are goods, services, technical data, as I said, that have been produced for commercial use and very often can have broad commercial application. At the same time, as the term dual use suggests, they can also be misapplied in other areas of particular concern for the US and other countries that manufacture or have control over this technology. So for instance, nuclear proliferation. I've seen oxygen tanks that are used very widely. COVID-19, we certainly became familiar with just how important those can be, but could have implications in a country where there is concern about nuclear proliferation. An airport scanner, so that body-held scanner, as you're walking through the airports, the officer comes up or if a beep goes off as you go through the kind of overhead machine, someone comes up and runs this handheld scanner up and down, and that can be controlled for export to certain countries where there is a concern that it can be used by terrorist groups, by insurgent groups, I should say, not so much terrorist groups, but insurgent groups, areas where you're having a lot of civil war, for instance. Had another example. Okay, yes, Princeton University, the Princeton University gets cited very often and then penalized for exporting pathogens, biological or chemical products that it sends to friendly countries, like Israel, like the UK, Canada, research institutions in those countries. However, because of concerns about these products being misapplied or misused for chemical or biological warfare, they are controlled for export and require a license. And so with the simple act of somehow just sending them off to their research partners around the world, Princeton has been found to be in violation and had to pay thousands of dollars of fines as a result. And it's also important to state that an export can occur so long as the technology that is being controlled for export is transferred in any way or shared in any way with a non-US person, even within the borders of the United States, then it's deemed to be an export. So to use a Princeton example again, I don't know that necessarily happened. Or let's use an example of another company with which I worked. They used a lot of encryption technology. This was a multinational corporation that had employees from around the world functioning, some of them functioning within the borders of the United States, but to the extent that where that technology was controlled for export, just sharing the source code, for instance, or sharing the blueprints, sharing drawings, technical data of the underlying, where the underlying technology is controlled, can be a violation if a license is required or if it's done without a required notification. And so it is important to be preemptive because of this broad understanding of what can be a dual use item. If you have a product or service, and it does not have to be, anything that's high tech. I would say, with the exception of food and beverages generally, then reach out to someone, your export agency in the U.S. There are what are called, the U.S. various services within the U.S. Department of Commerce, or at the level of your SBDCs and at the level of the states, and other countries have these services. Reach out to someone like myself to get your product classified, to be sure that, and it is likely going to be classified, but the classification that it gets is what's going to determine whether or not the product is controlled for export or the level of control that it attracts for export. The corruption carries a heavy cost. It can cost those companies that are competing ethically and are choosing not to pay bribes but want to win the contracts on the merits, their technical merits or cost merits. It costs the country that ends up paying money out for bribes, right? The government official, for instance, that pays money out for bribes, where the country does not see the benefit of that money. It's coming out of the public coffers, or where, as a result of a bribe, a company that is going to offer substandard or maybe even shoddy, or in some cases non-existent goods or services gets a contract, and then that's a complete waste and diversion of public resources with all of the other implications that we see here. And this is why many member countries of the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, or the OECD, have enacted strong anti-bribery laws to address this particular policy or to address this particular concern. And some of them, for example, the UK anti-bribery law is even stronger than the US Foreign Corrupt Practices Act that I'm going to talk about here. So the conduct that's prohibited under the FCPA is for the payment, promise of payment, or any agreement to pay anything of value to an official who is in a position to influence a business decision that impacts you. This could be so that you can get the contract. It could be so that your contract is extended. It could be so that your company is not blacklisted or somehow penalized for poor behavior, not your company, hopefully, but another company. And what is important here is the intent. So even if you make this payment, but don't get the contract or you're displeased with the outcome, that conduct nevertheless violates the FCPA. Now, what is anything of value? Cash is an obvious culprit, of course, but it can be anything under the guise of, say, consulting fees that are excessive or commissions. It can be gifts that are unreasonable. You know, you've been invited to a wedding and the wedding of the son or daughter of this government official with whom you deal on a regular basis. And instead of bringing a nice little gift that can be contained and, you know, you can bring with your two hands or whatever it is, they get an all expense paid trip to some destination of their choice. And these examples do happen. We don't have time to go into some of these hypotheticals here, but there was a Chinese company, for instance, a US company that was based in China and wanted to win contracts. And so they offered training trips to the US for all of these officials who are government officials because this was a municipal company. And except that these trips were to locations where the company did not have any facilities, no training was done, and they went to places like Las Vegas and, you know, Disney and that kind of thing. So just very, very clear red flags. And so you are what you are. And the other thing to note is that the payments, what is prohibited is payments to an official, a government official or an official of an international organization that is, again, in a position to use their discretionary authority to allow you for a business decision that will positively impact you. Now, the law recognizes, the UK does not do this, by the way, but the US law recognizes that in some countries, in order to have your lights turned on or to get a permit in 3 days instead of 3 weeks, or to get your goods cleared in a timely fashion, you have to make what are called facilitating payments. And that is permitted as an exception under the FCPA. The important difference here is that these payments are being made to someone who does not have the discretion. You have to get the permit. Your lights have to be turned on. Your goods have to be cleared. The only thing you're doing is having it done in a shorter time. And it's important to document these payments. It can't be you account for them. You put them in your books, and in that way you ensure that they don't violate the FCPA. So some important do's then. Your contracts. The language that will constitute an official contract is important. Is it the 2 languages or is it especially obviously when you're dealing in multiple languages or more than one language. It should also state the contract in what language will you do business. So when you have purchase orders or other kind of business documents going back and forth, the language for it to have official effect or legal effect, it needs to be in the language that you have both agreed is the official language for your transactions. It needs to address things like when and how you will be paid, in what currency, right? Who is going to bear the risk of currency exchanges, currency fluctuations? Who is going to pay the taxi? Which party? How will your intellectual property be protected? How long is the contract? That's an obvious one. Something that folks very often overlook is when and how can the contract be ended before its term? Suppose things are going south, it's not going well, then what does that look like? How do you notify the other party that you want to withdraw? How much notice they need to be given? And then also importantly, what happens if there is a problem that cannot be addressed through mediation, through negotiation, through discussion, and you have to take this into the legal system? Then where will that, what language, what court, whose laws are going to be used? Those are all things that are important to put in your contract. And then think back to, we talked about the FCPA and the consequences for violating anti-bribery laws. In many countries, you're familiar with the way things are done. You may hire a foreign agent or a foreign representative, or you may even be required to do that to help you win contracts, to help you win business. It is very important that your contract that you have a contract, first of all, an agreement with these persons, so that the liability that will attach to you under your laws are clearly stipulated in that agreement, and they acknowledge that they will not take any action that will jeopardize you and put you and your company and your reputation at stake. It's important to very clearly delineate the responsibilities, etc. Your commission structure is important. I mentioned not just for transparency and clarity, but also commissions, as I mentioned, is one of the ways that bribes can be hidden, etc. It is important to protect your intellectual property. If you have a patent, you need to get, which is the exclusive right to profit from the use or production of your invention, then you want to get that patented in the country in which you do business. Your trademark is a word, phrase, name, or symbol that you use to distinguish your company. Your trade secrets, a confidential formula, process, etc. And of course, any kind of original works of art. I have a colleague with whom I've worked in the past who is very knowledgeable about doing business in China. And she recommends that whether or not you plan to do business in China, that you get your intellectual property protected in China, because China's laws, they may be changing it, but I forgot to double check that. But they had a first in use right. And so even if you have worldwide use of this name or for your trademark, and someone beats you to it in China, then you have very little recourse or redress. And then finally, I am watching the time. Be proactive by preparing a manual, a document that incorporates into your everyday practices and business operations the guidelines and the rules, the red flags, the things that your employees, your third-party contractors, your foreign agents and representatives need to pay attention to. And having this kind of compliance manual or set of compliance procedures can actually be very, very helpful in allowing you to bypass, or in a number of cases, receive mitigating or lowered sentences or fines, not sentences, sorry, but fines usually for any violations that may have occurred inadvertently. Because what it does is it shows that you know you're paying attention, and mistakes happen, but then you also are able to use your compliance manual, your compliance toolbox, to identify when, where, how, by whom the violation occurred, and then identify ways that you can strengthen that particular weak link in your compliance processes. So very quickly, the slide, when you get it, will just have this summary of the red flags and your do's and don'ts, right? Where you have red flags, things to pay attention to. And let me end also with just sharing with you that I have a free ebook that you can get on my website, download, or email me for practical tips for global traders. And I'm also offering 2 attendees of this webinar a 1-hour compliance consultation at a discounted rate. And I will be sharing more information about that with you. So let me stop there and take your questions.
All right. Thank you so much for that very interesting presentation. So yeah, we're open for questions right now. But while we are waiting for questions on the comment section, I'll just turn on the groupie part of this platform, so we can document this webinar. So this platform will ask you to take a selfie of yourself, so we can have a documentation here. Yep. But yeah, while we are doing this, just please feel free to type in your questions on the comment section, so that she will answer the questions right after. Okay, so I'll start the group here right now. If you don't have any camera, that's fine. It's only for those people who have a camera right now. This is only for documentation, and you can actually share this to your social media pages.
So what do I need to do? Okay, go selfie. Gotcha. Okay.
All right, so some people are taking their selfies now. I'm just going to give like a minute or two for this, so we can proceed with the questions. But Andrea, if you can see the questions on the comment section, you can already start answering the questions here. I think I saw a few questions.
So is that under comments or is it under
comments?
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
I think the first one is, does your company prepare compliance handbooks as service?
Yes. Yes, we definitely do that. The other thing that we do is conduct trainings that guide you through the process of doing the manual yourself, or you and your company. So that can also be a more cost-effective way for you. So yes, absolutely we do that. And I will be sure to share in our follow-up email some information on that. Thank you for that question.
Next here is from Sushant. Is it possible to do entertainments, which we do in hospitality sector? I'm not sure if.
I'm not sure I understand that question. Could you clarify, please, the
Yes, please
asker of the question?
Yes, please do clarify that question. So I enjoyed your discussion on dual use products as part of controlled goods. Great discussion. Okay, that's a feedback. Would you advise reporting international scammers who pretend to be a legitimate company using techniques such as business email compromise? And if yes, is there Is there a central source to report such fraud?
I wouldn't say a central source, but I do know I would encourage folks to use that Ripoff Report, and I know it's used very widely. And yes, absolutely report it. I would also report it to to any agency in your country that cares about exports, that works with you on exports. In the U.S., there's the export.gov section of the U.S. Department of Commerce, for instance. So yes, I would absolutely encourage you to report these, because otherwise, how do we know? And another company, innocent company, can fall victim.
All right. And where is it possible to find a list of business registration databases, registries for verification of business license numbers received from customers in each country?
Okay, again, there is no central list, but most countries have a company office of company registrar, right? Some name, something like that. And so, what I do all the time is I just Google, should I say Google? I do a search for the for that country, Saudi Arabia Registrar of Companies Office. And then the site comes up. I did it for Malta recently. I did it, yes. And then, the link comes up and you go on. Now, some countries make their, a simple search, for instance, is free. In others, it is, it attracts a fee, but it's usually a very low fee. And so certainly worth the cost as compared to the this cost that you could incur by not taking that kind of due diligence.
All right. So thank you. Very insightful information on this video audio. All right. So yes, this video is recorded. So if you would like to get a copy of the link, I'll definitely, I'll leave my email before we end the session. From Sushant, he said that we entertain with lunch or dinner for guests and clients in restaurants and hotels is legitimate.
Yes, I understand your question now. So just to make sure folks understand the context, this is in, would that kind of entertainment be violating anti-bribery laws? So it depends on the specific rules of your country. But again, in the context of the U.S. Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, so long as you do two things, I will highlight two things. One, the nature of the event and how expensive the restaurant is and all the rest of that stuff is not going to matter very much. But ideally, best practice, you want to give your visitors pay them a per diem. And there are lots of agencies that have the guidelines. The US has guidelines, the EU has guidelines for every country. This is a per diem that you pay for X country. And if you are treating them to lunch that day, as a good practice, you might want to best practice, you may want to just say, okay, for that particular day, you're going to deduct what would have been the cost of the per diem for lunch, especially if it's a very expensive, restaurant. Again, better to err on the side of caution. And you also want to document that. So in and of itself, that kind of entertainment does not violate the anti-bribery laws. You do want to pay attention to your accounting practices, make sure that the costs are either reasonable or that you are somehow deducting it from any kind of other expenses that you may be paying on their behalf.
All right, thank you. Thus, the same apply for Canadian wishing to do business abroad. Are the same tools for due diligence?
Yes, the tools for due diligence Okay, so Canadians wishing to do business abroad. So I would say, honestly, that link that you're going to get for the US Consolidated Screening List is a must for any company. And then I do not know offhand what that would be for the Canadian. If you reach out to me afterwards, I'd be happy to help you search for it. But yes, there would be a similar screening list or site tool for Canadian companies. Yes.
All
And
right.
then in terms of, I'm sorry, and then in terms of like the Ripoff Report and those other things, yes, that's international.
Okay. Thank you. So we're still open for like two or three questions here. If you have any other questions, just please feel free to type in. Now, okay, this one is quite long, so yeah, maybe you can read that, Andrew. So you can answer after that.
Okay, we're developing an accountability system for grassroots NGOs to help legitimate organizations with transparency to support donors with their due diligence and NGOs to manage capacity building. Meant to be used in countries with higher instances of corruption. Okay, so Transparency International does that. Regarding the sanctioned countries, we hope to also go to countries on this list. What do I look at first? Okay, I cannot answer that question in the few minutes that we have left. What I can direct you to is every country that operates sanctions has a website that obviously lists that information. In the case of the US, it's the Office of Foreign Assets Control, or OFAC, and I have that list, the name of the entity in one of the slides. So OFAC, if you just Google OFAC US Treasury, then you should be able to get information on their sanctions program, US sanctions programs.
Yep, thank you. I suggest you put your email address here in the comment section so that they can copy the emails if they have more questions, or if they would like to set up an appointment with you, they can directly email you. But in regards with the recording, and if you would like to get a copy of the presentation, you can also email me. I'll reach out to the speaker so that we can get the copy. So all right, so yes, my email is, and Andrea's email is here. Please feel free to get it. We're open for another last one question while we are waiting, guys. If you also would like to be a member of International Trade Council, if those who are not yet a member, please feel free to email me so that we can talk about it. So, this is the last question from Mr. Nguyen.
Yeah, I'm not sure that that's in my area of expertise, identifying countries with poor villages, inform us of foundations of any villages that need assistance. Yeah, I guess that's to the general audience. A very, very important question.
Yep,
yes.
Mr. Joseph, please, yes, we will be sending that. Now, I will going to send the list of the people who attended and who registered to Andrea, so that in any event that she would like to reach out to you guys, she has a copy of your email address. But yes, feel free to email me with a copy of the recording. The presentation is with Andrea. I'll also ask for the presentation copy. Can you please send it to me so that if someone email me, I can just email them the copy?
I will. Mm-hmm.
All right. So I don't see any other questions. So I'll give the last 2 minutes, Andrea, as a final words to the attendees today. Anything else that you would like to add before we end the session?
Yes, I will. I want to stress the importance of being proactive, and just how important it can be in mitigating, both preventing problems as well as mitigating any kind of sanctions or fines, etc., that you may incur or attract, if you're discovered. It's very typical for small companies to say, okay, I'm going to fly under the radar, but the small companies are always being found and penalized. And unfortunately, unlike the large corporations, small companies are less able to recover from some of the punitive punitive actions that are taken in the case of a violation. So I want to thank everyone for listening to me this afternoon. Thank you for your very, for paying attention, and your comments and questions show that you did. And I look forward to staying in touch with you.
Thank you, Andrea. That's a very interesting presentation, and we look forward again for another webinar in the future. So guys, thank you for attending today. Again, if you would like to reach us, you have your email address. And thank you for your time, and see you again in the next webinar. Have a good day, guys. Thank you, Andrea. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.